returned from the Disability Studies Conference, it's national one, and I did a very similar talk yesterday. I had a bigger audience then, but for some reason I think I'm feeling a bit more intimidated in front of you today. So be kind, comrades, be kind. That particular session went over by 30 minutes. I only had like 15, 20 minutes to present, but we are having such a wonderful time talking about how burnt out we all are that we actually missed half our lunch break. So I'm going to try not to do that with you today because I've got another speaker after me, and I think Laura's going to stage an intervention and stop me. So yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk about my thesis research. Here I'm a counselling psychology student, and the wonderful Erica and Monica, my supervisors. I did a activist research, participatory narrative. I don't know. I just got together with a group of 7 other activists and we talked about how burnt out we are. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So my background is, as I said, I'm training counselling psychologist. I'm interested in narrative therapy in particular and therapy for social justice. But I have also been a disabled activist for the last 25 years, and I ran a disabled people's organisation. So this makes me both an insider and an outsider researcher. I'm very much part of the community I'm researching, but I'm also representing the academy. And I have been trying to do this project where I have been perceived as a threat. So that was interesting. That's another presentation. In terms of my epistemological standpoint, I'm still not entirely sure what my theoretical framework is yet. I think part of that is doing participatory research, like we all bring our own theories in. At the moment, I'm kind of moving more towards queer and crit theory and queer and crit activism, because I think that particularly for disabled people, which we'll talk about in a moment, it is the stories, the discourse that is positioning us that is what is oppressing us. So if we are to act against them, we need to create counter-narratives. But if we create counter-narratives, they have to be embodied. I am quite influenced by Butler on this. Gosh, I remember that. Okay, so I don't want to patronise you by telling you about what social model of disablement is. Hopefully you already know. But since this is a conference about the subjectivity of identity, I thought, well, this must be why I've been invited to talk to you today, because there's nothing more subjectively constructed than the notion of disability. You can almost see that if we start to reduce people purely to their impairments, it becomes a phenomenological nonsense, because each of us has the potential to experience some kind of health condition in our lifetime. Each of us will age. We're all going to need support or help at some time in our lifetime. So there's no, so who's disabled and who isn't disabled, right? So really, to understand what the word disabled means, we have to look at it from the Protestant work ethic. It's a capitalist construction. So the production of capital is presented as a moral imperative. Those who do not work are seen as morally degenerate. Those who do not work can become crippled, handicapped, the disabled, objects to be feared and pitied. They become the abnormal or the inhuman and the other. The disabled person becomes a tragic figure who is destined to die, and the individual medical tragedy story. Through the beginning of the eugenics movement and the early 20th century, disabled people are seen as a threat to the human species that needs to be eradicated, and we literally were in the T4 programme. This sinister assumed truth that we are better off dead than disabled permeates our culture and our daily discourse. And this manifests itself in real, painful, lethal, systemic ways. So we have an example of the scrounger narrative in the UK and the impact on modern social security policy, where disabled people are seen as units of cost and a waste of resources. There was increasing punitive and brutal social security system, which has resulted in an increasing number of welfare-related deaths in the UK. It was particularly painful during the pandemic, where 60% of COVID deaths were disabled people, and nobody questioned it. Similar to our racialised conways, no one questioned it. And during that, and I always bring this up because it's still really painful for me. During the pandemic, my son was issued with a do not resuscitate plan without his consent or our knowledge as a family, just because he had cerebral palsy. And he was one of thousands across the country who were basically told that they didn't deserve to live. So over the context of 2024, when I did the study within the disabled activist community, we had the sense that we were under attack from the state in terms of policy, in terms of rhetoric, from multiple levels. None of these things that are happening to us were new, but the fact that they were all happening at the same time. So I'm not going to read all of them out, but here's a few. So you might remember the Universal Credit and PIP Bill. You might remember the ending of the Right to Choose scheme for neurodiversity assessments. You may be aware of the increased surveillance culture of the DWP, including the right of access to claimants' bank accounts without their permission, and on and on and on. Whilst all this was happening, we also had this other piece of legislation going through the government called the Assisted Dying Bill. So this is assisted suicide. And on the right-hand side of this slide, we have the amazing Liz Carr, part of the Not Dead Yet campaign, with her assisted suicide is not a solution. So whether you agree with it or not, the timing of this bill was so brutal. It was, I get upset about it now. Yeah, the timing of this bill was just so painful for us as a community, because we were basically being told, you do not have the right to live, but we're going to help you die. And it has a lot of similar, sinister language to the T4 programme when we're talking about mercy killings. So this is not just a systemic attack on disabled people, it is an existential one. And I just want you to think about what that feels like, to be told constantly in actions of your society that you do not deserve to live. Okay? So, as I say, we have a word for this in disabled activist communities, this feeling. We call it burnout. And that's because the word internalised ableism is not enough. It's not that I've absorbed this fact that I don't think I deserve to live. It is the fact that I'm reacting to the fact that I live in a society that doesn't think I should exist. So for me, really, Fanon's idea, I know we keep talking about Fanon today, but Fanon's notion of the psychic violence being enacted on the state, by the state, on its people, is the closest to me. And his conceptions of internalisation within racialisation is closer to my understanding of burnout for disabled activists. So the term originally coined as part of as a mental health condition through the work of Freudenberger in free clinics movement in the 1970s. It was an activist movement. These were activist clinicians. The notion of burnout was that society's burning me out, right? It's society that's burning me out, right? It's not a specific work-related condition. Proctor has an excellent definition of it in her book. She talks about the psychological sense of defeat. We then compare this to more medical model approaches. So we have the F18 work-related neurasthenia in the ICD-11, and also the definition of activist burnout. And in both of these definitions, it's the work that burns you out. It's like a work-related injury, right? It's the activism, it's work that burns you out. And one of the symptoms is reduced work efficacy, right? It stops you from being able to work. So my participants in my study absolutely love taking these pieces, and for them, burnout isn't caused by the activism. In fact, the activism is what's keeping them going. Yeah. Okay, so I consulted with the Royal UK Disabled People's Community, activist community. I talked to 3 DPOs, and I spoke to hundreds a disabled activist, I go to events or speeches. I've mentioned that I was talking about burnout, and they come up to me in their droves, and I think part of that's because they're not being heard. So they wanted for me to create a project where they could share their raw lived reality of burnout. But even at this early stage, there was this real language of collectivism, action, and utility, and a way of and this to me relates to our identity as activists and disabled activists in particular. It's this notion that we need to have something useful that we can take back to the community, that it has to be collaborative and it needs to be democratic. So I agreed to run a focus group within a participatory framework to allow for some collaboration. And collectively, we came up with these two questions. There was what I wanted, me, who's interested in discourse. I was like, what does it mean? And then what they wanted to know is, what do we do about it? Right? And that was consistently, they didn't want to understand the meaning of it. It's what do we as a community do? So it's about action. So, as I said, I work within the narrative participatory research framework. For me, it was a process of reauthoring, which is just so important for us as a group together. So there's a process of separating our story from the painful, problematizing and alienating social narrative to develop our own story, which is more affirming and more aligned with our lived values and experiences. Part of this is identifying the master narrative, identifying those stories that are so painful and picking them to pieces. And participants were involved in the design of the study through the data collection to the analysis, and we're still having conversations in the analysis group even now. So as you can imagine, one of the main things that we identified was the medical tragedy story, and we rejected individual deficit and illness definitions of burnout. But what was also really interesting is that a particular character came up in our story, and this became our antagonist, which was selfish capitalism. And I was going back through the analysis, I was noticing how similar these ideas were to James's notions of the selfish capitalist. So it's the sense that individualization is actually quite bad for you. And this becomes personified as an antagonist. It wants us to be selfish. It wants us to be individualistic, materialistic. It wants us to be racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, etc. It is dehumanizing. And what particularly came up for the participants of this study is this notion that it pathologizes compassion, right? If we're caring, if we care, if we're compassionate, and if we get burnt out because we're caring and compassionate, that means there's something wrong with us. Alex says, I feel there is a lot of pressure on me saying I'm an individual and what I'll do is whatever is best for me. But what I feel strongly is best for me is to say no. I don't accept that premise. I'm a human. We're all human. So what is actually best for me is to be an activist, for me to advocate for us all and for me to try and improve things. Because I don't think what capitalism and other oppression tells us is best for us is actually good for us. I think most people don't thrive in this society where the focus is on just you as an individual. I think in general, when we fight for each other, we fight for humanity. So we reauthored Activist Burnout in a way which is closer to what we thought, what our real lived experiences were. So for us, it's not a mental health condition or an individual deficit. It's an inevitable consequence of caring in an uncaring system. It's a fundamental sense of powerlessness, a psychic disablement. It's exhaustion and overwhelm, a sense of not being able to switch off, the feeling that you're never doing enough and a constant drive towards activity, sort of like an anxiety response, yeah? A physical and emotional shutdown. The most painful for us as a group was that it disables our capacity to care. And this is mediated through our impairments and social conditions. It is particularly painful for a disabled activist when we have to face our disablement directly in our activism. This leads to a greater sense of disempowerment and alienation. The emotional and practical labour of having to overcome those access barriers, encountering disablism from microorganisms from microaggressions to direct disableist abuse is much more painful when it comes from our allies, particularly within the intersectional communities or within the social justice movement. There is emotional labour of having to constantly educate others about our oppression, because most people don't actually think that disabled people are oppressed. They don't recognise us as an oppressed group. There's the sense of like the pain of having to share our raw lived experience or being silenced, and this leading to a sense of exposure, our stories being used against us or leading us to be exposed to direct disableist abuse. This can be re-traumatizing, as it is a fundamental aspect of our disablement that we have to experience in our daily lives. So a solution to this sense of utter disempowerment was the group itself. That was a reflection from the group, that actually this process of coming together and working together was in itself a solution to burnout. And we draw from like William Finley's book, Disability Practice, but really this is my participants' words. And for them, practice is in the Aristotelian sense of the word. It is a process. It's in the action. It's in the doing. And I think there's a sense of in us being, the fact that we are getting together, recognising that talking to each other is doing something, working together and supporting each other is doing something, is the antithesis of the complete utter disablement we experience when we're burnt out. It's the recognising that disability is inherently intersectional. It's related to our social situation and other forms of intersectional marginalisations. It's recognising that our own oppression is through our own lived embodied experience. This is within the social model. When we recognise that we are not the problem, right? The problem's the problem. It's not because I'm disabled, it's because the system's disabling me. This is a very empowering process. And there's an ongoing collaborative reflection. Inclusion is active, and there's an emphasis on the collective and collective action. And perhaps most interestingly within this group, there was a sense that our own experience of oppression acts as a sort of empathetic bridge that draws links to other forms of marginalisation and marginalised groups. So recentering our activism as caring also acts as a counter-narrative to both selfish capitalism and burnout. So Alex says, I think it is when you experience being dehumanised yourself, when you see it happening to other people, it's much more difficult to turn a blind eye and not to notice, because you know how it feels to be in that position. So yes, I'm talking about it being an empathetic bridge, but for us, it was something liberating in this, because as a community of people who are so isolated, this connection or understanding of shared alienation, if you like, ironically, gives us a connection to others. Compassion becomes action. So we start thinking about reimagining our activism to mean care. So our activism comes from care, but maybe our activism could be caring. So we start to think about the pragmatics of working collaboratively. And this is the bit about having difficult conversations sometimes means the fact that we have competing needs, and learning how to navigate those competing needs becomes a microcosm of what we're trying to create on a larger scale, right? There's a focus on good doing and carrying acts, and there's an emphasis on creating community spaces. I'm going to have to skip this one, unfortunately. So the pragmatics of caring within a collective is offered as a performed alternative to being burnt out. But for, and I said this to the conference yesterday, we have this alternative within disabled people's movement. I'm sure you come across it here, where we talk about the politics of rest and resting is resistant. And this is problematic when we're thinking about the fight, when we're thinking about the fight that we need to keep on going against our marginalisation. If you think of the social model of disablement in a broader sense, where we see disabled people who are basically those who have been marginalised. So those who have been most marginalised, in society aren't just people like me who are deaf or my son who's got cerebral palsy. It's people who have been racialized. It's people from the LGBTQ community. They'll have a community of people who have been socially, economically disabled and are experiencing violence from the state. Thank you. Just 1 minute. Yeah, so in that sense, we cannot stop the fight. We can't rest, right? The movement cannot rest. Our collective cannot rest. However, if we work together as a whole, then as individuals, we can rest. And if we rethink about what we mean by activism, and that can include caring for each other, then it's possible to continue. So I'm going to finish off on something that one of my participants sent me yesterday morning. It's still sending me stuff. So, a choir can sing a beautiful note, impossibly long, because the singers can individually drop out of breath as necessary as the note goes on. This is what activism should be like.